She was not part of the festival. The festival had nothing to do with her, but the fact that she wanted to go there, I guess she was somebody that wanted to be seen where things were happening.
When you spend over 6 decades standing in front of a camera, or sitting behind one, you realize something fundamental about the cinema business. It is an industry built on illusion, but its creation demands an uncompromising, often brutal reality. We spend our lives crafting stories about human conflict, redemption, love, and betrayal, all while pretending that the people making those stories are pristine, harmonious architects operating in total sync. But that is the grandest fiction of all. Film is not created in a vacuum of polite agreement. It is forged in heat, in friction, in the collision of giant egos, desperate insecurities, and fierce artistic convictions. When you put passionate, uncompromising people together in a pressure cooker for 14 hours a day, under deadline, under budget, and under the glare of public scrutiny, sparks don't just fly, they set the whole damn set on fire. Over the course of my career, I have been called many things: a movie star, an auteur, an idealist, a rebel, and at times, an impossible, rigid bastard. And to be perfectly frank, there were moments when every single one of those titles was entirely accurate. I have always been fiercely protective of my craft, my vision, and my quiet space. That intensity has yielded some of the proudest achievements of my life, but it has also cost me deeply. It led to monumental clashes with people I deeply respected, brilliant artists who pushed my buttons just as hard as I pushed theirs. Tonight, I don't want to talk about the red carpets, the awards, or the glossy Hollywood myth-making. I want to talk about the friction. I want to lay bare 5 specific relationships in my life. 5 incredible talents with whom I clashed bitterly, fought relentlessly, and tore up the ground we walked on. 3 of those bonds, through time, reflection, and humility, found their way to grace and reconciliation. 2 of them, however, remained frozen in time, unyielding and permanently fractured. Looking back now, with the clarity that only age and distance can bring, I see that both the reconciliations and the perpetual silences tell the true story of who I was, who they were, and what it really cost to chase artistic perfection. Sidney Pollack was my artistic brother, my mirror, and at times my absolute worst nightmare. We made 7 films together over several decades, movies that defined my career, like Jeremiah Johnson, The Way We Were, and Out of Africa. But if you were to walk onto one of our sets back in the day, you would never have guessed that we were close friends. You would have thought we were 2 men actively plotting each other's downfall. Sidney was hyper-analytical, intensely neurotic, and lived in a constant state of verbal overprocessing. He wanted to discuss every single beat, dissect every line of dialogue, and master the mechanics of every single frame before the camera rolled. I was the exact opposite. My approach to acting has always been quiet, naturalistic, and grounded in instinct. I believed in saving the spark for the moment the director yelled, "Action!" The more you talk a scene to death, the more the blood drains out of it. Our dynamic reached a devastating, surreal boiling point on the set of 3 Days of the Condor in 1975. The tension had been brewing for weeks. We were shooting in New York, the weather was suffocating, and the schedule was grinding us down. Sidney kept pushing me for more explicit emotional reaction in a scene that I felt demanded restraint and subtlety. He wanted dramatic flair. I wanted cold, paranoid reality. We started arguing between takes. The discussion turned into a debate. The debate turned into a shouting match, and before I knew it, Sidney lost his temper entirely. In front of 100 crew members, extras, and studio executives, Sidney's face turned beet red. He pointed a finger directly at my chest and screamed at the top of his lungs, "Get off my set. You're fired." He literally fired the lead star of his movie mid-scene. The entire soundstage went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. I stood there, stunned, staring at this man who was supposed to be my closest collaborator. My pride was mortally wounded, my ego was burning, and every instinct in my body told me to pack my bags, get on a plane back to Utah, and let him explain to the studio why his picture was shut down. Instead of walking out the front gates, I walked straight into his private dressing room. A few minutes later, Sidney walked in, slamming the door behind him. For the first 20 minutes, we paced like caged animals, throwing curses at each other, venting years of accumulated frustration. But then, something shifted. As the air cleared, we both looked at each other and realized how absurd it all was. We weren't fighting because we hated each other. We were fighting because we both cared so fiercely about the film that neither of us was willing to yield an inch. We sat down, swallowed our pride, and cleared the air. We agreed on a compromise for the scene, walked back out onto that set, and finished the movie. That terrifying moment of total rupture ultimately cemented our bond. We learned how to navigate each other's stubbornness. We went on to make Out of Africa, which won Best Picture, and remained fiercely devoted friends until the day he passed away in 2008. Speaking at his memorial service was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but I knew I was honoring a man who had earned every bit of my respect through the fire. William Goldman was a legendary literary force, a master storyteller, and a genius of screenwriting. He gave me one of the greatest gifts of my career when he wrote Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Naturally, when it came time to make All the President's Men, a project that was deeply personal to me as a producer, Bill was the obvious, undisputed choice to write the screenplay. However, when Bill delivered his initial script, my heart sank. What he had written was a sharp, witty, highly entertaining Hollywood buddy picture. It played up the banter and the charismatic dynamic between Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. But that wasn't the story I wanted to tell. I wanted a gritty, meticulous procedural thriller about the absolute necessity of investigative journalism and the terrifying fragility of American democracy. I didn't want a comedy, I wanted an atmospheric nightmare. I knew that if I confronted Bill directly and demanded a ground-up rewrite, his pride as an Oscar-winning writer would cause him to dig his heels in. So I made a choice that I deeply regret, in terms of ethics, even if I defended it artistically at the time. Director Alan J. Pakula and I holed up in a hotel room in Washington, and behind Bill's back, we began secretly rewriting vast portions of his script. We threw out scenes, stripped away the light-hearted dialogue, and reshaped the narrative focus entirely. When Bill finally found out what we had done, the explosion was seismic. He felt utterly betrayed, publicly humiliated, and professionally stabbed in the back. He felt that his authority as a screenwriter had been brutally usurped by a star producer abusing his power. Bill went to the press and publicly stated that he deeply regretted ever getting involved with the film. For years afterward, my name was anathema to him. The success of All the President's Men, the awards, the critical acclaim, the historical legacy, did nothing to heal that wound initially. The ghost of that betrayal hung over us for a very long time. But time has a way of softening the edges of anger. As the years turned into decades, the sharp pain of the insult subsided, leaving behind the undeniable truth of what we had accomplished together. Eventually, Bill and I found ourselves sitting in the same room for retrospective interviews and panel discussions. The air was tentative at first, weighted with decades of unsaid apologies, but I took the initiative to publicly state, without reservation, that without Bill Goldman's foundational structure and brilliant narrative architecture, All the President's Men would have been an unmitigated disaster. I acknowledged my lack of transparency and admitted that my methods were ruthlessly unfair to him. Bill, in his immense grace, accepted that olive branch. We were able to laugh about the old battles, share stories of the chaotic 70s, and celebrate the masterpiece we built together before he left us. When I was producing Downhill Racer in the late 1960s, I wanted a fresh, cynical, unglamorous lens on the world of competitive athletics. I saw that spark in a young, brilliant television director named Michael Ritchie. I hired him, and together we made Downhill Racer and later The Candidate in 1972. The problem was that I was not just the lead actor in those films, I was the superstar, the producer, and the driving financial engine behind the projects. Michael was young, relatively inexperienced in feature films, and trying desperately to establish his directorial authority on set. But my instinct as a producer, combined with my stature as an actor, proved to be an overwhelming shadow. I walked all over Michael's authority. I micromanaged camera placements, dictated scene rhythms, altered lines on the fly, and treated him more like an employee executing my personal vision than an auteur directing his own movie. I was hyper-focused on the outcome, completely blind to how suffocating my presence was to his artistic process. Michael grew profoundly resentful of this power dynamic. He felt diminished, marginalized, and constantly undermined in front of his cast and crew. After we wrapped The Candidate in 1972, Michael privately vowed that he would never, under any circumstances, set foot on a film set with Robert Redford ever again. And he kept that promise. For nearly 30 years, our paths diverged completely. We went our separate ways in the industry, and the silence between us was vast and cold. As I grew older and spent more time sitting in the director's chair myself, guiding young actors and feeling the immense burden of trying to protect my own set, I realized the immense arrogance of my youth. I realized how difficult I had made things for Michael, a man who was merely trying to do his job with integrity. Before Michael's untimely death in 2001, I made it a point to reach out to him. We talked through those early, frantic years. I offered him an unreserved, sincere apology for my overbearing demeanor on those sets. I made sure to publicly give him full, unmitigated artistic credit in every retrospective interview, pointing out that the gritty, documentary-style realism of Downhill Racer and The Candidate was a direct result of his directorial brilliance. We reconciled our personal relationship completely, putting the ancient power struggles where they belonged in the past. When the script for The Way We Were first came across my desk, I turned it down flatly. I told the producers that I had no interest in doing the film. My hesitation boiled down to one primary factor: Barbra Streisand. Barbra was an absolute titan, a singular musical talent, an extraordinary actress, and a force of nature. But she was also notorious in the industry for being intensely controlling, relentlessly detail-oriented, and utterly dominant on every production she touched. My acting philosophy was built on quiet subtlety, understated performance, and living in the moment. Barbra's style was grand, theatrical, hyperverbal, and meticulously rehearsed down to the slightest eyebrow twitch. I felt we were oil and water, and I feared I would be swallowed whole by her overwhelming presence, relegated to a mere handsome prop in her romantic fantasy. Sidney Pollack eventually convinced me to take the role, promising me he would balance the dynamics. But from the very first day of shooting, my worst fears were confirmed. Our working styles collided like two massive tectonic plates. Barbra wanted to rehearse endlessly. I wanted to keep it fresh for the camera. She wanted to analyze every line of dialogue, dictate camera angles, review playback, and adjust lighting. I wanted to hide in my dressing room just to escape the relentless, suffocating energy of her perfectionism. There were days on that set where the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I felt constantly on the defensive, withdrawing deeper into myself, while she pushed harder and harder for control. I found her methodology agonizing, and she found my quiet withdrawal frustrating and impassive. Now, let me set the record straight on one major point. The tabloids loved to report that Barbra and I hated each other, that we had a bitter, lingering feud. That is simply untrue. Off camera, we developed a genuine, deep mutual affection and a high degree of respect for one another's talents. We remained distant, polite, lifelong friends over the decades. However, as professional collaborators, there was zero reconciliation. We both came to a quiet, unspoken understanding. Our creative philosophies were fundamentally incompatible. We could never subject ourselves to the torment of making another movie together. The artistic friction that produced that unforgettable chemistry on screen was powered by a real, agonizing incompatibility behind the scenes, one that neither of us ever tried to fix, compromise on, or bridge. We left The Way We Were as a beautiful, singular lightning strike in a bottle, agreeing never to risk opening that bottle again. If my dynamic with Barbra was a fiery clash of titans that yielded on-screen magic, my experience working with Debra Winger on Legal Eagles in 1986 was the absolute antithesis, an icy, uncomfortable, and thoroughly miserable failure of human connection. By 1986, I was an established director, an Academy Award winner, and a seasoned veteran of the industry. I liked my sets to be calm, highly controlled, professional, and quiet. Debra, on the other hand, was a brilliant, wild, completely unpredictable actress who thrived on raw emotional chaos, spontaneity, and confrontational energy. She was explosive, blunt, and completely resistant to traditional directorial guidance. From the moment production began on Legal Eagles, our dynamic spiraled into a Cold War. I tried to manage her with my usual quiet, understated, passive-aggressive restraint. I tried to pull her back, to tame her wildness to fit the slick, light-hearted tone of a studio comedy thriller. Debra loathed every second of it. She saw my controlled approach as cold, manipulative, and creatively suffocating. Instead of arguing openly like Sydney and I used to do, the air on set turned completely sub-zero. The atmosphere was miserable. Debra felt alienated and restricted, while I felt that her volatility was dragging the entire production down into unnecessary drama. We stopped communicating altogether outside of the essential directions required to complete a shot. She later went public, describing the set environment as ice cold, and she was right. It was an iceberg. When Legal Eagles wrapped, there was no emotional send-off, no polite wrap party exchanges, and no attempt to heal the breach. The rift was total and immediate. We cut contact entirely. There were no joint press junkets, no reunion panels, no nostalgic looking back, and no late-in-life apologies. I never considered her for another role in any project I ever developed or directed, and she made it abundantly clear she had no desire to ever cross paths with me again. It stands as the coldest, most unyielding relationship of my professional life. There was no growth, no mutual understanding, and no silver lining. Just two people who utterly failed to find a common language, leaving behind a frozen silence that remains unbroken to this day. When I look back at this long, strange, and beautiful journey through the cinema, I don't measure my life merely by the box office receipts, the awards sitting on a shelf, or the praise of critics. I measure it by the humanity I encountered along the way, in all of its chaotic, messy, brilliant, and painful glory. Conflict is an inescapable tax that art levies upon those who attempt to create something lasting. When you try to capture truth on film, you cannot expect the process to be comfortable. The friction I experienced with Sydney, Bill, Michael, Barbra, and Debra was not an anomaly. It was the price of admission for caring deeply about the work. I am deeply grateful for the men and women who stood their ground against me. The ones who reconciled with me taught me the profound value of humility, forgiveness, and the enduring strength of brotherhood forged in conflict. They showed me that an ego, no matter how large, can always be laid down in the service of love and mutual respect. And to those with whom I never reconciled, those whose paths drifted away into perpetual silence, they taught me a different, equally vital lesson. They taught me about my own limits, my own flaws, and the stark reality that not every broken thing in this life can be mended. Some fires simply burn out, leaving cold ashes where a bridge used to be, reminding us of our shared human fragility. As the quiet sets in and the shadow of the mountain grows longer, I look back at all of it, the loud arguments in dressing rooms, the bitter rivalries over script pages, the stony silences under the studio lights, and the warm, tearful embraces after the storm had passed, with deep, unreserved gratitude. Without that fire, without that friction, none of it would have mattered. Thank you.